Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Albany Behind the Scenes, How the New York Legislative Session Works. We're so glad you could join us to learn more about how legislation gets written, revised, and voted into law in New York, what's happening on the ground right now, and what you can do to get involved. I'm Louise Harrison, Long Island Natural Areas Manager for Save the Sound, and I'm your host today. I'd like to introduce our panelists. Senator Shelley Mayer. Senator Shelley Mayer has represented the 37th District in the New York State Senate since 2018. Prior to that, she served in the New York State Assembly for 6 years. Senator Mayer's district includes the Westchester County towns located on Long Island Sound, aligning her concerns and the concerns of her constituents directly with many of the issues important to save the Sound, including living shorelines, flood protection, and climate resilience. She's currently the chair of the Senate's Committee on Education. Assemblyman Steve Otis serves the 91st Assembly District of Westchester Communities on Long Island Sound. Before joining the Assembly, he was mayor of the town of Rye for 12 years, its longest serving chief executive. A member of the Environmental Conservation Committee, Assemblyman Otis has a long history of supporting issues of importance to Long Island Sound, including a municipal stormwater grant program included in the state's 2022 Environmental Bond Act. He currently is chair of the Assembly's Science and Technology Committee. Steve Liss is long-term counsel at the New York State Assembly and was counsel to the chair of the Environmental Conservation Committee for the last 10 years. He has worked in the Assembly for well over 2 decades, including most recently on the state's climate change and wetlands laws and the 2022 Clean Water, Clean Air, and Green Jobs Bond Act. Before we get started, I'd like to ask everyone in our audience to fill out one quick poll question about your previous experience interacting with your state legislators. So that might include sending them emails, making phone calls, meeting with them in person, anything you've done to reach out directly to your state legislators. We're going to be ending with questions and answers for our panelists. So if you think of any questions that you'd like us to ask, please drop them in the Q&A button at any time, and we will get to them in the last 10 minutes of this webinar. Well, it looks like 100% of you have done something to contact a state legislator in the past. And that's wonderful news. Glad to hear that. This is really interesting information for all of us as we begin our conversation. And we're going to check in again with all of you at the end and see how you're feeling about your confidence in participating in the legislative session. So let's begin with some general information about how legislation comes into being in New York State. Have you ever been driving down the road and you think, oh, there ought to be a law, but then you had no idea what to do about it? I imagine that's happened to most of you at one time or another. Certainly it's happened to me. New York is complicated. It's got many layers of government, from villages to towns and counties, and ultimately, of course, the state. Now, if the law you're thinking about is a state level law, for example, a law that affects our state highways or our state parks or some other area over which the state has jurisdiction, then what can you do? You can talk to your state legislators. Everyone is represented in the state government by an elected representative in the Assembly and another in the Senate. You can look up your representatives here, so you see those links. We'll put those links in the chat too, for you to copy as well. You can contact your senator and your assembly member to raise the issue or the idea for legislation that's of interest to you. State legislators meet with their constituents all the time. They meet with us too at Save the Sound, and they listen to our ideas about legislation to fight climate change, save endangered lands, protect the Sound and its rivers, and work with nature to restore ecosystems. That's a lot of words, but that's a lot of committees. Legislators and their dedicated staff develop bills they want to raise. The ideas for some of these bills come directly from constituents. Ideas for new bills also come from advocacy organizations like Save the Sound and from legislators themselves. Once drafted, the bills are introduced to one of these committees for discussion and further development. Often, public hearings are held at which you may have another opportunity to participate in the process. This list of committees and subcommittees gives you an idea of the breadth of issues addressed during each legislative session. I'll just give you a moment to scan over that. Now, committees may choose to report a bill to the full chamber for consideration. They may amend a bill or they may reject it. Eventually, some bills make it out of committee and onto the Senate and Assembly floors for further discussion and ultimately a vote. Sometimes a bill is amended in one chamber and moves back to the original chamber for further consideration. Finally, if passed by both chambers, the bill heads to the governor's desk, where, if in session, which often goes between January and sometime in July, sort of loosely stated, the governor has 10 days to either sign it into law or veto it. A 2/3 vote by both chambers is required to override a veto by the governor. And governor can also choose to do nothing and allow a bill automatically to become law. That's a vastly simplified version of how an idea becomes a bill and becomes a law. Now, for more information, let's go straight to the source. We're going to speak with our panelists who actually do the work of the legislature. Panelists, we'd love to see your faces again. Great, thank you so much. So, if you would you care to correct the information I just shared that was very generalized about how an idea becomes a bill, becomes a law? I'll ask Senator Mayer, how did I do?
I thought that was, given how general it was, that was exactly on point. When you get down into the nitty-gritty of an idea, a bill, something to be in the budget, which is one thing we didn't discuss because many important things happen in the budget, including sometimes policy ideas that could otherwise be a bill. I think that's actually a very accurate general description, but I think one of the advantages of having my colleague, Assemblyman Steve Otis and Steve Liss, who we've all been around a long time, is there's a lot of intricacies and none of it should be so intimidating that it keeps people away from participating. This is your option, your opportunity to give good ideas to us to consider. And I know Steve and I have gotten excellent ideas directly from Save the Sound that we've translated into legislation. So as a good example of from the ground up.
Thank you. That appreciate that. That's also interesting about how sometimes policy things get folded into a budget thing. Assemblyman Otis?
Well, you know, I laughed at your the slide you had of driving down the tunnel and what do you drive by? And I had a bill signed into law in December. I'm walking by a construction site and I see labor notices that are required at workplaces. He's sometimes seeing bulletin boards and it's outside and they're weather beaten. And I'm saying this is no way for workers to learn their rights and their health and safety rights. And so we did a bill to require all employees, all employers to provide those legal notices digitally. And actually, the work site was along Long Island Sound, so there's a link there. But the best ideas come from when we meet with constituents, when we meet with local officials. And I'm going to mention an issue that was in the budget, but in statute as well, which is something that Steve Liss worked on and that Shelley worked on with me. which is the creation of the Water Infrastructure Improvement Act in 2015. And how did this idea come into existence? Local officials were basically complaining that they didn't have enough money and financial capacity to do very important clean water projects. And so just from that kind of interaction at the local level, Steve and Shelley and I and others in the legislature, and Shelley was in the assembly then, that was an assembly proposal in our assembly one house budget bill that became law and has been a very successful program statewide for clean water and for Long Island Sound. Now for the Westchester alone, over $65 million in projects has come from that.
That's amazing.
It is just listening to people and then figuring out whether it's in a bill or in separate in the state budget, how you get it over the finish line and get something good done.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it also points out to me that if a person didn't know which representative to go to, they might show up in town hall and town hall might say, we can't afford it. And this shows how the state can work with municipalities. So Mr. Liss, would you like to add to this discussion on?
I think in general, they have the assemblyman and the senator are correct, and you gave a broad general outline, and that's all right. Senator Mayer talked a little bit about the intricacies. I'm not going to bore anybody with it, but most of the intricacies, interestingly enough, come from either the Constitution itself or custom. Everything from when does a bill get sent over? You have to wait for the governor to request it, to how much time does the governor have? That is in the Constitution. So a quick read of the Constitution for those of us who actually enjoy that stuff will enlighten many.
That's really helpful to think about. Thank you. So I'd like to ask you all, what else happens behind the scenes that ordinary citizens really don't get to see as a bill makes its way through the legislative process? And this might be something that would be encouraging or perhaps less than encouraging to a constituent, but maybe they need to know about this and as sort of reality setting or expectations leveling. Senator Mayer?
Well, I'll give a good example. I think it was prior to Ida. It was one of the earlier storms. Maybe it was Sandy. At the time, I was an assemblywoman representing Yonkers, not on the Sound Shore. But it was clear that these issues of inland flooding that was not directly on the Sound or the river in Westchester or on the ocean, but were streams and rivers. The flooding of these inland streams and river had not received sufficient attention at the state level. And yet during these terrible storms, of which we've now had many, with terrible consequences, these inland streams were causing really serious property damage and sometimes personal damage and a complete shutdown of our communities that had happened. So I drafted a bill with the input of many of my constituents who felt like somebody's got to pay attention to this. And the bill did pass both houses. And it was when Governor Cuomo was governor, he vetoed the bill saying, well, there already are task forces about flooding. And I actually think he was quite wrong because there was nothing that was focused on inland flooding, which was, and it was actually sort of prescient because in Ida, inland flooding was the thing that really killed us in so many communities, Mamaroneck and Portchester and Rybrook and Tuckahoe and other places. But my point is, here's a good idea. Getting it past both houses of the legislature is not something that happens automatically. Sometimes people say, well, who would be against it? It's not that people are against it. It's that in order to move it, it takes a lot of energy and working with your colleagues, the senior staff like Mr. Liss here, the central staff, the leaders' offices, and you get it to the end, and then you think, oh, this is sort of a no-brainer, the governor's going to sign it, but not a no-brainer, and the governor vetoed it. I would say, because you pointed out vetoes, having been in the Assembly and Senate for some time, in supermajorities, we have never overridden a governor's veto. So while it is, as Steve points out, sort of a right set by the Constitution, otherwise, as a practical matter, overriding a veto is highly unlikely. And so what you do is you take this good idea and you go back and try to fix it so it can get a governor's signature. And that's some of the work that goes behind the scenes.
And that sounds sort of like the more productive way to do things anyway. So in my opinion, Assemblyman.
Well, so I think Shelley casted quite correctly, and I had to give a little more detail because the details make a difference. And so a bill, and you may have a bill that has a great purpose and great ideas, but we have in both houses a central staff operation of analysts. Most of these folks have either law degrees or a master's degrees, and they analyze the bills. We hear from many interest groups that say, oh, we like the idea, but you didn't get this detail right, or there's this unintended consequence. You may get even proactive feedback informally from state agencies. And so to get something that is really quality control worthy of being passed and signed is a process, and you have to be able to we often amend bills, and sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't work, but this is actually a good thing, I like to say, because there are a lot of bad bills introduced also, and so quality control is an important thing. I like to say, not all my colleagues agree, it shouldn't be too easy to pass a bill. We should make sure we get it right. Or as President Eisenhower, I have a President Eisenhower quote that applies to this as well, which is, don't make your mistakes too quickly. This is, I think we want to do things right and take the time to do things right.
Seems like good advice to all of us. Mr. Liss,
Sure.
have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. At the staff level, we take our direction from the elected officials. They will tell us which bills, which issues they want to primarily focus on for the year. But what goes on behind the scenes and really isn't known is staff gets together with central staff, usually it's chair's staff, and we go through the bills not only line by line, but word by word, very carefully to make sure there aren't any unintended consequences. When Mr. Otis mentioned bad bills, one thing we also notice often is that a lot of bills are put in are already law or conflict with current law that will cause big problems, or they're just drafted in a way which is unmanageable. So staff goes through that. We make suggestions, or after running it by the chair, back to the principal sponsor of the bill, suggesting ways to make the bill movable out of committee. That is a laborious and often time-consuming process. And the public and sometimes members themselves don't realize how much time and effort goes into something like that. Memos are shot back and forth, emails all over the place, and the circle gets wider, when you're dealing with something that's going to affect, well, it's just income. No, it's really not. There's also a codes issue because there's a crime, and there's a local government aspect to it. All that staff will be brought together. And again, we actually go through it, not line by line, but word by word.
That's really important to think about. I mean, New York has such an enormous body of laws. How could any given legislator be familiar enough with them all to know if the bill they're suggesting even has any wings? I could see the important role of staffers. I came out of the executive branch having worked in 3 different agencies in New York. And I know that often the agency people are asked to look at laws because they are the ones who implement them quite often and sort of know them. They're very familiar with the laws in place. And so I suppose that at what point do the agencies get consulted on these things? I'm not sure exactly when those bills sometimes came to me, but I wasn't sure how that how they moved out of the legislature over to the agency.
We will contact the agency. And you bring up a very interesting point, because sometimes, again, I'm going to use the word custom. There's the black letter law, the actual words on paper, and then how the agency implements it. It's not always the same thing.
Mm.
But we have to know how they implement it and why they aren't following black letter law, which is troubling often to the elected officials.
I can see.
Let me add a little sort of political piece to that, which is it depends on the governor. This governor, Governor Hochul, has given greater abilities to her commissioners and councils in the agencies that you may have worked for, Louise, to speak directly to legislators about their ideas. Over the last few days, I've had conversations with several commissioners about bills of mine that were vetoed, but they're willing to work with me to try to get the goal of my bill reached one way or another. But I would say, quite frankly, under Governor Cuomo, they were less able to speak directly to us, and therefore we sort of got boxed in. At the end, they'd have an opinion which we had not heard previously. Maybe the staff had, but the member hadn't. So the more there is communication, and I think all my colleagues would agree, both of them, over a period of time, the more we hear from an agency that this doesn't work well, or you have a good idea, but it really is not workable, as Steve has said, you know, that's helpful. We are in a process of trying to make change, not just get a bill signed for some egotistical reason. That's not valid, but to make real change and to make it meaningful, we need to have a lot of people weigh in on whether what we're doing is correct and works.
Well, thank you for adding to that. So this is something, the next question, which you probably could all speak to at great length, but I'm going to ask you on this one to just say it really fast, like top things that come in your mind when you have, you know, the day in the life. What's the day in the life for you, Senator, Mayor? What are the words that first come to mind when you have to tell somebody what you do from day to day?
Well, in the times we're not in Albany, it's a combination of being out in our communities, being present at events or meetings or things outside of our office, and then somewhat inside the office to work on some of these legislative issues. And then from June to January, December, largely not in Albany, every day and every night, including weekends, present in the community as much as possible, hearing from people one-on-one and in groups. I think that's one of the secrets to being a good listener and getting things done for your constituents.
Thank you, Assemblyman.
I think the variety is an amazing part of it, and makes every day different and every year different. And there are just a whole host of issues that we work on. Shelley and I were on the phone earlier today, and we were talking about some flooding issues, some clean water issues, some sanitary sewer issues. So that's just you know, a snippet, and so it's the variety. And I think what Shelley said is true for any elected official. It is very important to be visible out at events, because people come up to you with ideas and problems, and not everyone would think to pick up the phone or send you an email. Sometimes the best ideas for legislation or issues to work on come from the fact that you happen to be out in an event and someone sees you and they come up, and suddenly you have a new project that you can work on. So that is a key part of doing the job, is making sure that you are accessible enough so that you can learn what the issues are and come up with new things to work on. Very important.
It sounds like it's sort of educational. Like when you're in that job, you learn a lot.
I think that's true.
Mr. Liss, now you have a much different kind of a day in the life.
Yeah, I saw a film today. I'll start off. Yes, it is an education which never ends, because every year you're hit with new issues, and people do come up to your staff. You have the public and lobbyists which will come up to you and suggest changes. If a lobbyist comes up to you, usually the first thing you do is send them back to the elected officials, because we don't usually take direction from lobbyists. That goes to the elected officials. We let them decide whether or not they want to come back to staff. But the breadth of issues that you are exposed to daily is enormous. It's things you can't ever have anticipated. Now, everything from, I'm going to use a legal word here, does a lake have standing? In other words, does a lake have rights? That was a recent issue that came up that we had to deal with. To the more mundane, I can remember very well, an assemblyman came up to me and he had a letter from a constituent who was very angry. They got a ticket for making a right on red. And there was a sign that was behind a tree that said, "Don't make a right on red." And he was furious. And as a result of that, we thought about that for a bit. And we said, the right on red sign should probably be hung near the traffic light. So we changed the law. Now, those are the sort of things that every day is different, and it is never boring, never.
I can imagine. Maybe I can't. All right, so another lightning round. Senator Mayer, what is your top legislative priority for this particular session?
Well, as chair of the Senate Education Committee, which is the biggest chunk of the state's budget, as much as I have a lot of environmental and flood-related priorities, getting every school district in the state the money they owe is my #1 priority, and as well as expanding full-day pre-K for 4-year-olds outside the city of New York. There's the education issues are substantial, particularly post-COVID, and as we deal with learning loss and mental health. So on top of that, working very closely with Steve Otis, we have a number of environmental priorities. And we also want to make sure that the Environmental Bond Act, which we're so pleased has passed, is implemented in a way that benefits our communities and those that need it the most.
Thank you. Those of us who have long careers in environment realize how important education is, and it's a cross-cutting topic. It crosses every other topic. That's the way I see it anyway. Assemblyman Otis, your priorities for this session.
Well, certainly on the environmental front, we want to make sure that the Climate Action Council plan gets implemented on a good feasible pace, but we want to move ahead with those important issues, which certainly also reflect upon Save the Sound issues, because climate change, large storms, flood damage, they're all interrelated. Water temperature, which is a water quality issue all over the state, algae blooms and all these things are exacerbated by temperature rise. So Climate Action Council plan implementation is something that is going to be a mixture of executive actions. There may be parts that require legislative action. We're going to look and see what's in the budget related to that. Certainly, I pay a lot of attention to all the clean water programs, and very eager to see the rollout of the new stormwater grant program that was in the Bond Act. I have a host of other non-environmental issues I could talk about, but we'll keep the focus here. I would say for Save the Sound and communities in Long Island Sound, there are opportunities. Shelley and I are working on sort of coastal resiliency issues, and there are also federal grant opportunities and state grant opportunities. If you're involved in your community, municipality should be looking for projects they should be doing on a coastal resiliency area, because there's money available now that may not be available forever. So want to pounce on those opportunities and take advantage of the moment.
Right. And all the partnerships that help build up a good grant and a good product. So I imagine when your staffers get involved, they can help direct different applicants to other pots of money and build some really good application together. So thank you for those. So I just wanted to say to our audience today, some of you have probably seen Save the Sound's legislative priorities already in an email we sent out recently. We'll just put them up here on the screen for a moment and let you know that you can study them in more detail on our blog at savethesound.org. Steve,
Louise?
yes.
Just one other thing, which is usually overlooked, is the regulatory world.
Thank you.
You get a really good law, and then the agencies which then make the regulations to enforce or go forward with the law to implement it can be produced in a way which either defeats the law itself or mutes it substantially. So taking a good look at what the DEC, what they're going to do with wetlands, which was recently passed last year, critically important. Both the elected officials mentioned the moving forward on the climate law. That's something else I'd want, I think people should watch very carefully, and they're interwoven.
I think that's a really good comment. And yes, I was in 3 of the, environmental agencies over the years, DEC, Parks, and Department of State. And I dealt with regulations, and in some of them I was implementing them directly as a staffer. And yeah, that's a sort of that tension and balance between executive branch and legislative branch. But quite often, the face of the law is the way the agencies implement them. That's how the public sees the law. Because people aren't usually looking them up on the books, but seeing the behavior of the people in the agencies and how it affects them directly. So I'm glad you brought that up, and thank you. Thank you for that, Steve. So we have talked about how our legislators, staffers, and organizations like Save the Sound participate in the legislative session. But the question you may be asking is how you can participate. And my colleague, Alex Rodriguez, Save the Sound's environmental justice specialist and a grassroots organizer par excellence, is going to share a few concrete actions you can take while the legislature is in session. Alex?
Thanks, Louise. And I'd like to pay my appreciation to you and the rest of this panel for their outstanding insights on the legislative process in New York. This work truly requires a village. No one person can do this by themselves. This past autumnal season, or really summer season, we Save the Sound got involved in the Bond Act coalition to push forward on some of those outstanding principles mentioned by the panel earlier: clean water, improvements in climate resiliency, improvements in greenhouse gas reduction technologies, land protection. Those were all on the ballot, and New York voters voted yes on the Bond Act by an overwhelming number. And now comes the follow-up. Now comes the strategizing. It is very important for newcomers to the movement to identify a group that they'd like to get involved with on a particular cause. Save the Sound's major programmatic areas are climate action, clean water, protection of public lands, and ecological restoration. For those of you watching right now, we certainly would love to partner with you in some way, exchange strategy, give best guidance for the testimonies that folks will soon be submitting in the next month or so. So choosing an environmental group to get involved with is one action. Emailing Save the Sound to gain updates on the status of the priorities that Louise briefly put on the screen. We will be sending emails out over the course of the session to give you all an idea of where is especially helpful to weigh in on. And we prepare sample action alerts for folks to submit directly to their legislators. So those messages can say something as simple as Assemblyman Otis, I need cheaper energy in the Queens area. Electricity rates are overwhelming right now, and they could be combated through expansion of energy efficiency programs. Or Senator Mayor, my community in the Bronx is very vulnerable to coastal flooding. There's got to be something we can do about this. What bill could I support? Messages like that. And keeping in touch with those elected officials is very important to the process. When you can't reach them by email, certainly reach out to their offices and leave a message behind with their staffers, and always be human with the staffers. They are people like you and I, and they work under the elected official, and so many times they may not be authorized to give the elected officials take on the issue unless they've been fully briefed. But signing up for your elected officials' emails is an especially important part of the process, because they won't always just update folks on legislation that they're working on, but important social services that communities should be aware of, and thank them for their role in the process. If you can't meet them up in Albany, then certainly look for them in their district. Seek out a time to grab a coffee with them or a group of people that share your issue, and that could be an especially useful way in forging relationships to build political power for your cause. You can track the bills that you care about with the link we've provided here, and we will drop that in the chat as well. And also participate in rallies and Capitol lobby days to which you can. We will certainly update folks on any lobby days that we participate in over the course of the session, so that you may get involved as well. And participation in any rallies is especially helpful. Just days before the new year, there was that slim deadline that Governor Hochul had to sign remaining pieces of legislation into law, and advocates went to Albany to rally outside of the Capitol to raise momentum about the cumulative impacts bill that was signed into law, and the right to repair bill as well, and some other pieces of legislation. And those were signed into law. Do not underestimate the importance of mass mobilization. And something that we didn't mention here is also also put your words to paper. Look for newspaper outlets to share your stories and how they relate to a particular cause, a particular piece of legislation, because this was something that the Bond Act Coalition did extremely well on. They built a coalition of people representing New York State and New York City, the 5 boroughs, and they spread their cases for the Bond Act. We support the Bond Act in the Bronx because of these reasons. We support the Bond Act in Buffalo because of these reasons. And that was especially useful in getting that done. And so the same would apply here in promoting pieces of legislation. And lastly, share your passion with your family and your friends. It takes a village to tackle these issues. And just want to again express my appreciation for this panel, for sharing their insights.
Wow, Alex. Now I know why we hired you. Anyway, Senator Mayer, do you have anything to add to that, or any advice you would give to constituents or supporters when they're out there advocating for their dream legislation?
Well, I really appreciated Alex's insight, because 2 of the things that he spoke about are extremely important. You can get to see us or our staff or easily, and you either can email, you can call, you can set up a meeting in Albany, or you can just set up a meeting closer to home. You know, both Steve and I, our offices are in Portchester, but we meet with people everywhere. So thank you for making that point. You should know who your senator assembly members are and get to know them. And secondly, I was so happy you talked about coalitions. I mean, we are sort of more political animals, those of us who run. That's how things get passed, when people organize jointly. So sometimes people come and say, I have a great idea. Why don't you get it done? And I'll say, you need to build a coalition of support, because it's not just myself and or Steve. We need our colleagues from all over the state to also buy into the idea. So the more you build a coalition, and like Save the Sound has done very effectively in partnering with other environmental and justice communities, when you build a big coalition, you have enough momentum to try to get something done. So I really appreciate Alex's perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Assemblyman?
I think that Save the Sound is part of a larger network of advocacy and groups on environmental issues that's active in Albany. And honestly, the environmental community has a long history of great advocates, and we have environmental advocates, we have Sierra Club, we have Audubon New York, we have Citizens Campaign for the Environment, and many other groups. I'm not going to name them all, but all these folks work together and mobilize their members around the state in terms of the kind of grassroots advocacy Alex was talking about. And it has made passage of the Environmental Bond Act possible. It has made some of the big gains we've made on substantive issues and budget issues over the years possible. These things didn't just happen because of the legislature. They happened because of all the input from the public and these groups. I can't think of an area where subject area where there are more sophisticated advocates than in the environmental area. So we're very lucky that way. And more work to be done, because we always have to keep pushing. So it is all good.
Thank you. Steve Liss?
Yeah, I would say don't get discouraged, because I have heard members say this, and I've said it myself. A really good idea that no one is opposed to often takes 2 to 3 years in Albany to become a law. So if it doesn't happen in that first year, don't take it off your list. Stay at it. Don't get discouraged. Those things sometimes take more time. It's not just that people are sitting on it, it's that it has to work its way through the process, and that does take some time. And quite often, going through the process improves it.
That was another good point. Thank you. By the way, some of you are writing in your questions, and we will be getting to them at the end. So thank you. So I want to thank you for that input. That was really helpful. And now we're going to see how confident the audience is starting to feel about getting involved in this upcoming session. So we asked you at the beginning if you'd ever contacted your state representative before, and you had, all of you, in one way or another. But here's another question for you. We're going to put up another poll. How confident do you feel about lobbying for your issues this legislative session? Looks like you have some confidence building needed. We hope to help you with some of that before we end today. Thank you for your candid answers. So we just have a few more minutes, but one of the questions, I think, one of the first ones that came in, and it occurs to me a lot, is how diverse New York State is. My career has been on Long Island. I came out of New York City. I've always been aware of sort of an upstate, downstate schism, a chasm, something. I don't know. There seems to be more than a bridge required, and we have two. So it being that it is so diverse with different landscapes, different issues, different cultures. How do you handle something that a piece of legislation that has to appeal to all of the legislators in your chamber somehow? How do you get that to work if it's something that really seems like it's sort of custom fit for Long Island Sound, but people up in the Adirondacks, just doesn't really resonate with them? Senator Mayer.
Well, it's a great question, and it's a very important question, because our conferences, which, for a layperson means like the Senate Democratic majority, we sit together, we have a majority, so we sort of determine the agenda, and the same in the Assembly Democratic majority. The conferences are very diverse. So we have a lot of members from New York City. We have a lot of members from the suburbs, Long Island, Westchester, and the Hudson Valley. And then we have a lot of members from upstate cities and from the rest of the state. And to your point, Louise, you're trying to develop a consensus where there's at least support and respect for your idea. So an example is when I've been talking to Save the Sound recently about some of their excellent ideas, their work now includes much of the Bronx and other parts of the city of New York that are adjacent to the Sound. And it's important for us to bring in our New York City colleagues to realize these issues are very important to their constituents, who frankly are hit harder in some cases by asthma and environmental issues than some of our more suburban colleagues. So to build a coalition with members who you might not think of as easy partners on issues is extremely important. And also to be conscious and mindful that New York is a diverse state, as you said, Louise. And our job is not only to serve our district, that's number one, but also to do things that are good for the whole state of New York. So you have to be able to explain and pitch your idea to people who, like you said, might be from the Adirondacks or Buffalo or the Southern Tier. And I think, when you've done it and you build personal relationships and people understand that you are not adverse to them, but you're building things that are good for the whole state, you can build those diverse coalitions which are necessary to pass bills and to get things done. That's how I see it.
Assemblyman?
Well, I think that especially in environmental issues, there's more commonality than differences. We have water quality issues all over the state, and they may be a little different in other parts of this, different parts of the state. One of the things that the governor has in her State of the State address is to deal with an issue of trying to help, and this is generally smaller upstate communities, with some technical help as they apply for state funding. And downstate in the suburbs, maybe there are bigger budgets for municipal staff. And so some of those communities have the ability to apply for stuff better than a tiny municipality in the Adirondacks or in the Finger Lakes. And so the governor is proposing to try and tackle that in some way, which is a good thing. But the especially on environmental issues, water quality on Long Island Sound and sewage, they're asking that same question in the Finger Lakes and in the Adirondacks in terms of septic failure and their water bodies. So I see the answer to the question is you build the unity for the whole state by trying to make those connections and say that the issues may be slightly different, but they're really connected. And so we're going to get something done.
Thank you. From a staffer's perspective,
I
Mr.
agree
Lewis?
with both the senator and the assemblyman, which is always a safe position for staff. And I'll go a little further and say that Mr. Otis is right. There is a huge commonality, and this will sound like a constitutional amendment that we did not last year, but the year before. Almost anywhere in the state you go, people want clean air, clean water, and a healthy environment. Doesn't matter if you're a farmer or you live in the Bronx or you're looking out over the Sound. Those things are pretty constant. And it was strangely a hard fight to get that added to the state constitution. Every New Yorker has that right now because there were, surprise, surprise, people who were against it. It took a little doing, but once it got the opportunity to be placed on the ballot, it was passed overwhelmingly by the public, upstate, downstate, New York City, Long Island. It didn't matter. That constitutional amendment passed overwhelmingly.
I don't know how many other states have something like that. It's pretty robust and amazing. Now, what do you think, how does the federal budget affect your work in the New York State Senate, Senator Mayer?
Well, we try to follow closely what's happening at the federal level because one, there are budgetary streams that are funneled through the state and then go out, number one. Two is there may be opportunities. Steve and I worked very closely for one of our communities with a federal funding stream that went through a state agency to help people have their homes potentially bought out if they were subject to flooding as they were in Ida and they became uninhabitable. Steve found this federal funding stream and we got to our state counterparts in the agencies and we were able to get a significant number of people interested in potentially having their homes bought out. It took a lot of digging, but we work closely with our Senator Schumer and Senator Gillibrand's office and our Congress members to make sure that both funding and legislation, of course, right now, there's not going to be a lot of legislation because they're at loggerheads, but generally speaking on funding issues, particularly during COVID, we work very closely to try to be on the same page and maximize every dollar we were getting from the feds for our district. So we definitely try to be on the same page with them and to be in constant communication with them.
Anything to add to that, Assemblyman?
Well, I think with the money that came to the states via the COVID crisis, we've had and continue to have access to federal funds that is more robust than would normally be the case. And so I think one of the challenges for New York is to make sure that we take full advantage of those opportunities and especially try and draw those down on some of the environmental issues that we care about that we can't fully fund on our own. Those federal are not going to be there forever. And so the states that are going to be most aggressive about figuring out through the U.S. Treasury Department guidelines on how you do that. And so we in the legislature and in the executive branch are going to work to try and maximize those opportunities.
Thank you. I'm noticing we only have 2 minutes left. I don't want to hold busy people up with your important schedules. And so I'm just going to say to the people who've asked questions we haven't had a chance to answer yet, that we will pursue your questions and try to answer them for you. And on behalf of all of us at Save the Sound, I hope that those of you who are still with us are feeling a little more secure about your ability to, or your willingness to interact with your representatives, and you'll find a way to dip your toe in this session and get involved in some way. We'd like to help you, especially, of course, on environmental issues that we're involved in. And of course, I want to thank our panelists again for joining us today, Senator Shelley Mayer, Assemblyman Steve Otis, and Mr. Steve Liss, as well as our environmental justice specialist, Alex Rodriguez, here at Save the Sound, and our colleagues behind the scene who are working the pulleys and the lights and the curtains that you can't see right now, the men and women behind the curtain. We really appreciate you taking all of the time you've taken today out of your schedule and sharing your experiences and insights into what goes on in Albany, encouraging people to get involved. Personally, I think if you were my representatives, I'd be knocking on your doors tomorrow. You seem, you're very approachable and you really explain things very well. And I think that's what people really, in my opinion, want for their first step. And everybody listening, if you'd like to sign up for Save the Sound's emails, be looped in on advocacy opportunities, coalition opportunities, please do email us at info@savethesound.org. And the link is in the chat. Thank you again, all of you, for joining us, and good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Louise, for your hosting, and thank you, Save the Sound, and all my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you, Save the Sound.
Thank you.
And thank you, Senator and Assemblyman.
Nice to see you, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.